Okay, hello to everybody. Thanks for attending our club luncheon. The goal of the club is to bring together all Democrats, from the most conservative to the most progressive, to celebrate our shared values, appreciate who we are, and to work together to put more Democrats in office, especially during an election year. I'd like to mention our club luncheon sponsor, Albrecht & Albrecht Law Firm, has been supporting this luncheon for several years now. If you need legal help, please think about Albrecht & Albrecht. Our program today will feature Professor Paul DeBell. The name of his talk is "What Can I Do to Defend and Deepen American Democracy?" So before we start that, let me just run through a few housekeeping things. Everyone is asked to stay muted except for the speaker, myself, and Kathy Devine and Karen Pontius, who will be handling questions. And if you want to submit a question during the luncheon, please use the chat feature on Zoom. There's a button near the bottom that says chat, and then you can type your message in there. So please do not unmute yourself and speak. Send your questions to everyone in the chat window. So make sure that that'll drop down there that says says everyone. If you're having trouble with your internet connectivity, you may want to disable your video. Audio only works better on slow connections. This Zoom meeting is being recorded and will be available within a few days for viewing. You can also choose speaker mode, typically in the upper right corner, which will bring up a larger video of the person who's speaking. And I'd like to encourage everyone to donate to the Plata County Dems in this election year. Monthly donations are particularly appreciated, and you can set those up on ActBlue. So monthly donations make it easy for you to give to the party with relatively little pain. This is our first club luncheon for 2022. The Club Luncheon Committee is working hard to bring some great programs for this year. Our March 1st luncheon will be a forum featuring the Democratic candidates for CD3. This will be just a few days before caucus and assembly, so you'll get a chance to decide which candidate you want to support to remove Lauren Boebert. If anyone has any other announcements to make, please enter something in the chat window and we'll recognize you at the end of the luncheon. Now to our speaker. Paul DeBell is an assistant professor of political science at Fort Lewis College. His teaching and research interests span political psychology and comparative politics, with particular focus on democratic governance, the psychology of political division, and the role of emotion in political behavior. Dr. DeBell's dissertation analyzed the link between populist outrage and democratic backsliding in the country of Hungary. His current research, teaching, and advocacy revolves around the psychology of democratic citizenship in light of 21st century challenges to self-governance. Outside of the classroom, he spearheads FLC's civic engagement and voter education efforts through the FLC Engagement Collaborative and the Community by Conversation series. Let's give a big virtual welcome to Dr. Paul DeBell.
Well, thank you, everybody. It is really wonderful to be here again. So thanks to Gwen and the team for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you about this really important topic. So I've got some slides that I'm going to share and work my way through, but I just want to acknowledge this is a huge topic. We could go in lots of different directions. So I'll just appreciate your questions, your comments. We can certainly guide this discussion in whatever ways are going to be most useful and efficacious and interesting for you all. So as Gwen mentioned in his very kind and generous introduction, I teach political science at Fort Lewis, and this is the main thing that we talk about in classes these days. I came to this study of the United States actually by studying the rest of the world. I never thought that I would study American politics when I was in undergrad and graduate school. I really focused on Eastern Europe, Russia and Hungary in particular. And you know, when I started studying those countries, they were young, promising democracies. And over the course of studying my research question, which was going to be how does a democracy consolidate in a young democracy, both of those democracies, first Russia and then very dramatically Hungary, disintegrated in any real sense of the word. And now that same sort of threat has become really critical at home. So today I just want to share with you some of the perspectives that I've learned from the study of the two fields where I work in, which is political psychology on the one hand and comparative politics on the other. Comparative politics being that branch of political science that studies domestic politics of other countries to try and glean broader lessons about how politics work in our current contemporary age. So we're going to talk about sort of what is the nature of this democratic crisis that we face today. what, as I mentioned, do these two fields have to say about where we've been, where we're going, and what we can do to try and change where we're going? And I hope that today we can have some sort of concrete action items that you all feel like that you can do. I want to start this by noting that I'm not going to talk about one big element of what you as the Democrats can do. I'm an unaffiliated voter, and in my position, when mentioned, engaging all students in civic activities, I maintain that, but of course, one thing that I think from the Democrats' perspective to do is to win elections, right? So I'm not going to be talking about that. There's a whole other list of tactics and things that we could talk about there. I'm really going to be talking about the structure of how democracies unfold and what it'll take, the very high bar of what it's going to take to turn this ship around. And that's going to involve a lot of really actually reaching out to people that we disagree with, where we can find reason. That's not going to be a blanket statement, but just want to acknowledge this talk. When I debate this with my very fired up liberal mother, she doesn't like some of the advice that I'm going to give. So I just want to acknowledge that. So democracy in the United States, we have had 10 consecutive years. So this is not just a Trump thing. We've seen most measures of democracy, and there's a lot of different measures of democracy because there's a lot of different conceptualizations of democracy and ways to look at it. But most of these measures, whether you look at this measure here, Freedom House, which is probably the most widely used and famous, there are lots of other scores, varieties of democracy, the Economist Intelligence Unit, lots of different indicators. They all show that American democracy has been in decline for about the last 10 to 12 years. You can see that Freedom House here is really saying that this is, political corruption and conflicts of interest, lack of transparency, and then they look at some human rights issues. So they're looking in particular at some of the punitive policies around asylum seekers and immigration. But I've got a list here that would be gleaned from lots of different studies, and this is by no means exhaustive. So if you don't see what you think is wrong with American democracy on this list, that's just because it's a long list. But here are some of the real key things, and there's a lot here. And I think I want to start here just by acknowledging just how many opportunities we have. We have so many problems, but we can think of those also as opportunities for engaging our the Democrats and other civic groups in trying to move some of these issues forward. Now, of course, the top issue here is this sense of an open insurrection and the rejection of elections, which really strikes to the very heart of self-governance. And so I'm going to talk a lot about that, but I just want to acknowledge that we see among both political elites and the masses, we see lots of different indicators of weakening support for democracy and endorsement of democratic norms. We see enormous inequalities underlying or underpinning a lot of these issues, for sure. The United States has a really unique, it would be a euphemistic way to say it, unique relationship with money and politics. Money and politics are connected everywhere, but we have a really just open system for money going into politics. And that's been something that there's some new reporting just this week showing that the Democrats have also been really taking advantage of dark money in politics. And this has been very much a bipartisan arms race, perhaps initiated more on the right, but the left is catching up, and there's a lot of consequences for that. Our institutions do not necessarily promote political majorities. We have a lot of what political scientists would call minoritarian institutions, which elevate certain groups, particularly thinking about institutions such as the Senate or the Electoral College that do these things. And of course, we know that we have polarization, gridlock, inefficiency. And that key, what we would hope would be nonpartisan offices like the FBI have become highly politicized. And then, a topic controversial with the Democrats, but that we have a system that really breeds us versus them with the two parties, right? That it sort of naturally puts us into the us versus them thinking. And I'm going to have a lot to say today about how that mode of thinking seems to be one of the key variables that destroys a population's ability to govern itself. So lots going on there. And I just want to note that this is, I think the issues that we're facing in the United States are unique in some ways, but the trend that we're a part of is not. And here is from that organization, Freedom House, which really researches democracy all over the world. And you can see that by their measures, we have a long line, unbroken chain of decreases in the number of polities worldwide that are considered democratic. And again, this is one indicator by one research organization, but we could look at lots of different research organizations' findings with lots of different assumptions and methodologies and measurements, and we would find something very similar. And what we see is that 2020 was a particularly bad year for this, right? We see that the number of countries that declined and their democracy scores way outstripping the number of countries who increased. So this is part of a global trend. And in the United States, of course, a big part of what we're dealing with is this divided sense of reality. And of course, not a divided reality because there's one reality, but there's certainly a divided sense of what's real and what's going on. And that's been very stable. So for somebody who studies surveys a lot, these numbers are surprising because over a year, you see virtually no movement. And that's kind of strange. You usually would expect more movement than this, even if it was just random chance. And we see this sense that the last election was very much cast into doubt, and we know that we know how that happened, and that the effort to delegitimize the results started a long time before that election, and went up to present times. But we have a really big issue here, because one thing that I'm going to argue is that democracy really is about about people accepting when they lose. And so how we encourage that amongst ourselves and amongst political opponents, I think, is going to be a linchpin upon which a lot of the future of our ability to govern ourselves rests. And we see that there's been very little movement. We have large majorities, about 3/4 of Republicans, not viewing the current government as legitimate. And that really is the breeding ground for not just a destruction of democracy, but for a breakdown of social order and a peaceful civil society. And so this is something to really, I don't want to be an alarmist here, but I do want to just note that this is extremely urgent. This is not things might happen. Things are very well underway, and we have a lot of work to do if we're going to change the course of this, because we've got a taste of where this could go, and I fear a taste of where this could be going. So I just want to open this up, because like I said, there are so many different ways we could talk about this, so many different threats. I kind of want to open it up to you all. What is your, when you think about the destruction of American democracy, what do you think is happening? What are the big threats? Just you to put in the chat or speak out loud if you'd like. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective a little bit.
So I guess for this point, if you have something to say, just go ahead and unmute rather than trying to put it in the chat. So I see Charles West put something in there.
Right. So low turnout for sure. If we don't have sufficient turnout, can we really say that there was a democratic election, right? That the people have chosen, or our voter suppression, people trying to vote, not being able to. Yeah, Jen's noting 2010 is an infamous year for money in politics. So yeah, perhaps some of these things are really linked. And in fact, I don't have a slide for this, but I think that there's a lot of argument to be done that putting pressure on corporate leaders becomes a really important method here, because we've seen historically that that business interests often can swing things at the margins. All right, so religious fanaticism for sure. We know a lot. I just finished Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower, and there's very much this dystopian religious fundamentalist future. Nullification of votes. Yeah, so Sally, I think that's what I'm most worried about too. I think there's a lot of issues, right? There's a lot of issues that we often focus on. The voter suppression idea is really this sense that people are showing up to the polls and being turned away, or being dissuaded from showing up in the first place. One thing that we saw in 2020 was, or rather, in the run up to January 6, 2021, is that it was after the voting had happened that there were some really big challenges. Now, of course, those challenges turned out to be unfounded, and even the investigations by people who thought that Trump had won didn't yield any actual evidence of that. But the center holding after the 2020 elections does not mean that the center will hold after the 2024 elections. And I think that's, for me, that's my nightmare scenario, is that we have the votes come in and it looks like it's going to go one way, but then they're certified because now the people putting the people who be certifying elections in places like Georgia and Arizona might not be the same people who would hold that center. They might go with it. And Gwen, and you emailed me asking what the Constitution has to say about that. The Constitution doesn't say anything about that. I mean, so we don't have real constitutional guardrails for that situation. I mean, the Constitution says that the election will be certified based upon the winner of the Electoral College, but it does not say what happens exactly when the kind of challenges that we've already seen and that we can, I would say, completely expect next time to arise. We don't really have much on that. And so this is where our actions and our preparations for how we're going to think about and talk about and engage become really important.
I think that the whole issue of voter suppression and nullification of votes and disbelief in facts is mentioned several places here.
Yeah, and that's a big part of it. So thank you for raising that. I mean, this very nihilistic sense that we can all believe whatever we want to believe, I think is becoming quite pervasive, and that's something I think that we need. And I don't have an answer for that, so we need to really work together to figure out ways to push back on that. I'm just looking at lots of people talking about alternative truths and proliferation of mistruths. And yeah, I mean, Carol, as you're saying, attacks on elected officials, we're seeing this real escalation of intimidation, whether that is the people running elections, like we were talking about, county clerks, elections officials, but also school boards, and we've seen some of that in our own local community. And so there's a real increase in the political temperature that we're facing right now. So today we're talking about democracy. So I just want to do a little bit of work on what that concept means in the first place. I think that this will be something that most of you are very familiar with, so I'll go quickly, but do let me know if we need to stop. When I ask students to define it for themselves, you can see a word cloud of their responses, and they get it pretty right? You see people as the biggest thing there. And indeed, democracy, if you look at the Greek etymology, it literally means rule by the people. And this is a notion that political scientists call popular sovereignty. Of course, sovereignty refers to who has the ultimate decision-making power, who has the ultimate authority at a given place at a given time. And popular sovereignty is the idea of the people should. So you often hear this idea of people power. And this is the very basic version of what democracy means. It's giving the people the power to make the political decisions for some self-governance. And many would add a caveat that you also, to have a full democracy, need to also protect rights. And so there's this long theory or long vein of thought, really worried about, if you just give the majority everything at once, that can really harm a lot of people in society. And so there's these ideas that you want people power, majority rule with a lot of things, but you also need to have the rights of particularly vulnerable minority groups, unpopular minorities, people with unpopular opinions. Those need to be protected against what will be called the tyranny of the majority. Democracy itself is this really difficult concept. So you can see here is another research institute idea, and they go around measuring democracy. And so you can see this is their conceptualization of what democracy means and how they can think about these sort of 5 core criteria, and then how they go out and look to that. And so you can see that this is a very difficult and broad thing to measure, and this is a very difficult and broad thing to protect. And democracy is really an ideal. Like, what does it mean for the people to rule? Well, that's going to be inherently and internally conflictual in a lot of ways. Who gets to be the people? What happens when, as we know is going to happen, the people disagree? And so in sociological theories, this is referred to as an ideal type. And an ideal type is just this idea that it's a sort of a perfect form that can't exist in the real world, but that we still think about and theorize about and talk about, so that we can hold up a real example. So that if we want to compare Canadian democracy to American democracy, we sort of have a yardstick, a point of comparison. And so we have to acknowledge that this is a very difficult thing, and that over time, as for example technology changes and the way that we engage with information changes, what this will look like will also have to change. This is what social scientists call as an essentially contested concept, which means we've been spilling ink about it for thousands of years, and we don't really expect, it's essentially contested, meaning we don't expect to come up with one definition that will make everybody happy, or one conceptualization that'll make everybody happy. And so, what you have to do is think about, well, here's what we're really going for, and getting beyond that. So why are we bothering with this sloppy concept of democracy? I mean, on the first level, it's because that's the word that we have. That's the word that, as Schmitter and Carl, that I'm about to quote here, have said, they've said, this is the word that, for better or for worse, springs from people's lips when they want to bring about a better life. And so this empirical study of democratic governance has really found that, it's not the subtleties of governance is really where a lot of it comes out. We have a mistaken belief that, once you are no longer in a democratic system, it's going to be like everything about your life is going to be completely different. And that may be the case, again, particularly for vulnerable minoritized groups. But for a lot of people, one of the problems with the democratic backside is that it happens so gradually and it doesn't seem to actually affect people's day-to-day life. But democracy does matter when your back's up against the wall. One very famous finding coming from Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen is that democracies seem to be able to stop some of the worst things that can happen to a population. Notably, Sen, who's from India, is talking about things such as famines. That basic ability of the people to, even if it's only just determining through elections who the government will be, that seems to provide some accountability, which lacks in some other types of political systems where sometimes famines just happen and people suffer from it. One of the real seminal pieces of work on this is this Schmitter and Carl piece. And what they argue is that what you get out of a democracy is the ability to adapt over time in a consensual way without the breakdown of peace. So they argue the democratic wager is such that the regime will not only persist by reproducing itself within its initial confining conditions, but will eventually expand beyond them. Unlike authoritarian regimes, democracies have the capacity to modify their rules and institutions consensually in response to changing circumstances. So this ability of the public to push back, to hold accountable the governing decision makers turns out to be a really important pressure valve in society. But when we're going to talk about democracy and defending democracy, I think we also need to recognize something that I find very troubling, but that is just true whether or not I find it troubling, which is that in the discourse in the United States today, democracy itself is becoming polarized. Like all these things that we didn't think would become polarized, but the word itself, democracy, is quite polarized. I was listening to an interview on an organization I'm going to recommend today called Braver Angels, which brings people together to have tough conversations. And they had a professor on the political right talking about the legacy of January 6th. And he really said that, the United States was not conceptualized by its founders as a democracy, but rather, of course, as a representative republic. And so he argued that what he cared about is not the deepening democracy, but a fair and just republic. And of course, and then he cited, thoughts going back to ancient Athens about the threat of mob rule, of maybe majority rule is not always a great thing. My images here are lots of books that I would highly recommend. And this book, right, by Jason Brennan, Against Democracy, the thesis is right there. But this line of thinking that's critical of democratic self-rule is alive and well, and it's a real debate. I mean, this is a good book. Jason Brennan would argue that we need an epistocracy, which is rule by those with information, and that he has these sort of complicated institutions that he would advocate for, by which you gain issue expertise, and then you gain sort of political voice and political decision making prowess in different domains. So there's lots of different exciting ways we can think about reform. But I would say that just from studying this topic in different cultures and different societies, that we are left in the 21st century with really one dominant way that we legitimize our politics. And that's really important. If we feel like, if we have diverse groups in a society that feel like their political institutions are legitimate, that is the first prerequisite for good, effective governance. And it's really hard to think of a way to get there other than some sort of popular sovereignty. And so I think that at this time, we have to recognize that the words are very loaded, but that if we're going to engage, we do need to engage in a discussion about what does popular sovereignty look like in the 21st century, because it's going to look different than it has in previous times. How do we keep fairly representing the public? How do we keep fairly representing the will of the public? And so a big theme that I think is true is that the time that we're living in right now is really scary. And it's rightfully and dutifully scary, because a lot of scary stuff is happening and can happen. But that this time is also a time of great flux. So the same things that make us scary, make us scared that it could change really rapidly can also give us hope, because some of that rapid change could address things that there is bipartisan opposition against, like the role of money in politics, for example. So this is a time of great opportunity as well as a time of great possibility for bad things to happen. It's a possibility for good things to happen as well. So when we think about democracy ending, we usually have this image. If you close your mind and imagine the end of democracy, you sort of imagine like the tanks rolling down the streets. And that is so 20th century. In the 21st century, we're seeing that democracies typically end by the ballot box. And this is, of course, something that we have some personal experience with these days. The process, again, this is the sort of seminal source here, How Democracies Die, by these two longtime comparative politics scholars, Levitsky and Zablat. They call this executive aggrandizement, the idea that somebody gets into power through democratic means, and then that executive aggrandizes or expands their own power, and basically says, if you go against me, you're going against the democracy, you're going against the people. And so this is a very common way. This is indeed what happened in Hungary, as well as many other states where we're seeing really big challenges to democratic governance. And of course, this is in a way what's happening here, although it happened much less subtly here than it does pretty much every other society I've looked at. But as Levitsky and Zablat argue, the problem here is that that our misunderstanding of democracy makes it very vulnerable, right? So the tragic paradox of the electoral route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassin used the very institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it. And indeed, I would argue or add to this that they use the very language or discourse of democracy, that usually this is done in the name of the people. And so that's why I think a big point that I'd like to leave us with is what I was saying on the previous slide, that we really need to have a discussion. Okay, like you say you don't want a democracy, but you prefer a republic. What does that mean? Because we need to get pretty specific with what we mean by the type of government we want. Again, I think we have a big opportunity to redefine what that means in a way that addresses a lot of those problems that we started out with, that long list, my sort of laundry list of woes with the American political system. But if we just are yelling democracy versus republic against one another, we're not ever going to get there. And so we need to have a really serious discussion about, well, okay, what is it that we want in specifics? Like, what does this look like? So what I mainly study is emotions in politics. And so I study anger and disgust, and it's been a busy decade. And the emerging consensus, it really is that polarization is the Achilles heel of democracy. Democracy is this really tricky thing. Democracy does not exist if we all agree. Democracy is institutionalized political conflict, and it's conflict that happens in elections and legislative bodies and courtrooms and caucuses rather than by shooting each other on the streets. But of course, that conflict can go off the rails, as we're seeing. And what is really key here is that we can lose and then fight another day. And so probably the most famous quote about democracy in the academic study of democracy is by a Polish political scientist, Adam Jaworski. And Jaworski states simply, in a democracy, somebody loses. And it's not like when you're going up against Putin in an election, you're going to lose. Like, this is like what we've seen in recent elections, like losing and being surprised about it, because there's real uncertainty in the elections. That uncertainty, which we call contestation, like the real level of contestation, is the key that seems to hold a lot of the other parts of democracy together, right? That public pressure. Now, this requires us to have norms of legitimate opposition. That means, if you and I are running against one another and you win, I concede. And of course, we've seen that norm, that really critical norm, broken. And that's so critical because what you're saying therein is that there is not a legitimate opposition. And so you see this Pew survey data basically showing that on both sides, people feel like the other side is such a threat that if they win, it's not okay. I'm not going to fight another day, but rather they think that this will be some sort of like world-ending event. And what that does, that's very pernicious, is it allows you to justify absolutely anything you want to do to beat your opponent, right? So if your opponent is beyond the pale, then and they're illegitimate, they're dangerous, they're traitors, then anything you do is therefore justified, and you get into this escalatory cycle of conflict and eventually violence. I mean, so I don't want to pull any punches here. Like, that's people who study violent conflict look at it as a cyclical process, by which, some side does start it, right? It's not even, but it escalates. And this is where we are now. We have these different information realities. We have no shortage of animosity towards one another. And we are in this process of upcycling political violence. And so this is why polarization becomes really, really key. So I know that, again, this is a tricky message to give to a partisan organization. You all want to win elections and see your side of polarization as right. And I think you have a lot of data points to back you up. But at the same time, no one side can save this. Like it really does democracy, because it is institutionalization of conflict. You have to we all have to figure out ways to re-institutionalize this norm that we're going to have transitions of power, and it needs to be peaceful. As you all have been mentioning, I think a big fundamental crack in our ability to govern ourselves is just that we live in these different information bubbles, and it makes it really hard to even have the conversation about what our goals are, let alone how do we get there. We also have the universal human bias called confirmation bias, which is when you try and go out or when I try and go out and learn about a political issue, I am much more likely to just sort of lazily confirm information that is in line with my pre-existing views, right? So if I am a really big proponent for gun control legislation and I want to learn more about the effectiveness, how do you decrease gun violence? When I see something that says, the studies on legislation to decrease gun violence are pretty mixed, I'm going to dismiss that. That's actually called disconfirmation bias. I'm just going to out of hand dismiss that. And then when I come across a different study that supports what I already think, gun control legislation works really well, then I endorse that. And so we all have that. This is not a left-right thing. This is a human being thing. This bias to kind of within our own information bubble, just kind of keep reinforcing our own beliefs, right? And of course, all that means, as you all know, we don't have this sort of shared public space anymore. And this to me is something that we really need to work hard to reclaim, because I don't know that there's a way out of this without doing so. And I want to make clear that doesn't mean convincing everybody. That means really paying attention to who is reachable and working really hard to reach them. So speaking of who's reachable, there's a lot of misunderstandings about everybody right now. We're all misunderstood, and we're all misunderstanding is what that means. There's a really cool website. Actually, a student, this is new to me, a student just on one of our discussion boards posted this last week, and it's called The Perception Gap, and it's working with an organization that I know well called More in Common. They're a research organization really trying to find common ground. And they did this really interesting series of studies where they asked Democrats and Republicans to rate their own views on these issues, right? So if you're a Democrat, you would answer all of these for yourself. And then you were asked to rate where you thought the average Republican would be on all of these. And what you can see here is the gap between where partisans actually placed themselves on average and where out partisans, that is to say, Democrats looking at Republicans or Republicans looking at Democrats, would place the other side, right? So for example, you can see that that Democrats are really, really misunderstood, right? So a pretty large majority of Democrats, we're looking at about 80% of Democrats, would disagree with the statement that most police are bad people. Whereas you have Republicans saying that most Democrats are gonna have that view, and you see this difference between the two is the perception gap, right? Conversely, on the other side, you have where Democrats think most Republicans are. You'd say the average Republican, doesn't think that properly controlled immigration can be good for America, where, a lot of Republicans do think that. So this isn't to say that there's no disagreements. There are huge disagreements, but we experience politics in this very binary, everybody on this side agrees and is very extreme and vice versa. That's not actually very true on most issues. There's a lot of middle ground. So I guess what I'm saying today, we're going to have a big kumbaya, reach out to people argument about what we need to do, but I'm not telling you to reach out to people that are, sort of completely beyond where you're willing to go or where you're willing to talk to or connect, but rather to suggest there's a lot of people who aren't quite there, that even on some of the most polarized issues in American polity, abortion, immigration, guns, there's actually a lot more people in the middle than our typical political discourse shows us. And if that doesn't seem right to you, that's because you're probably a small group of the American public who's very, very politically charged. We find that this is not a case where more information decreases the bias. This, in fact, is a case where more information increases the bias. The more people follow political news, the larger their perception gap is. And we know that people on the political extremes, so very, very far to the left or very, very far to the right, are the most sort of politically active. They're the ones most likely to read the news. And so you see here the average perception gap among these different groups, right? And so this is Moore and Commons. Their researchers came up with this sort of typology to look at the American public, and you can see they put it on a left-right spectrum. And what you see is that the people in the middle actually don't have as big of a perception gap as those on either side. And then that, you see here, this is where the independents are. So the independents are always tracking much closer to where actual partisans are on these things. You see that we really, if we needed any more evidence, I don't know that you needed this evidence, but here it is. I thought this was a nice if harrowing visual. When Democrats and Republicans are asked about the other side, you see positive qualities are very low. So you get 24% of, or you've got Republicans saying only 24% of them think that the Democrats are honest, whereas 86% of them think that the Democrats are brainwashed, right? And sort of right back at you on the other side. And so we have this. Sorry, I've got a really touchy mouse today. And so we have this sense of misunderstanding on both sides. And this to me is really interesting because just from every semester I work with students to have a difficult conversation with somebody they disagree with. And I've noticed that maybe the number one thing that really causes a conversation to blow up is feeling like you're being stereotyped. Like my students get this all the time. Oh, you kids these days, or you college students, and they say right back, oh, you older generation, or you Republicans or Democrats, whatever it is, right? Feeling pigeonholed, like you're not really being listened to, but like somebody heard something on MSNBC or Fox News about you, and that's what they're assuming of you. That seems to really break this down. And so again, sort of working past some of our own assumptions about one another is key. Really useful, harrowing resource is Brightline Watch. Brightline Watch interviews and surveys academics and political elites about what they think is going on. And so Brightline Watch has been doing a lot of work on American democracy. And this is actually an experiment that they did that's very, very fascinating. It's very much in line with the evidence I was just showing you. When they asked Democrats and Republicans whether they would endorse certain things, right? Like so endorsing government agencies not being used to monitor, attack, or punish political opponents. So just like in the last study, they were asked, where would you put yourself and where would you put people that are in your party versus the other party, right? So if you're a Democrat, they'd say, okay, what's your personal view here? And then they would ask, what do you think the average Democrat's view is? And what do you think the average Republican's view is? And so, for example, here you see the actual values where Democrats and Republicans place themselves are charted here. And where they think that they put the other party are the triangles. And so what you see, again, is these huge gaps between what we think about the other side and what they think about us and actual reality, right? So, this gets really contentious, right? Elections are conducted, ballots counted, and winners determined without pervasive fraud or manipulation, right? This is really what a lot of the debate is coming down to. And what you see is that we hold this as a shared value, right? So this is what they would say they're committed to. Of course, where the rubber hits the road is what constitutes fraud, and so there's a lot of movement there, but you can see these really big gaps between how we think about one another and where people actually would place themselves. So a little bit of comparative politics now. This is like some old social science, but I think it really holds up well. And this is going to talk about the structure of groups in society. And in comparative politics, we call this a cleavage. A cleavage is any line between different groups. So for example, you could have a geographic cleavage between rural versus urban, or you could have a religious cleavage between Protestants versus Catholics, or religious versus non-religious. And what we're finding more and more after decades of study is that it's not the sheer number of these differences that matters, but it's how they are related to one another that really predicts this. So this is kind of complicated. So just let me know if I'm not getting through. But so there's one idea that's called overlapping cleavages. And that is where the structure of these different differences are placed on top of one another, right? And so in this hypothetical, this is just a slide from my comparative politics introductory class, but right, in this example, right, if somebody's a Sunni, you can also assume that they're upper class, you can also assume that they're urban, you can also assume that they're Arabic speaking, right? And if all you know is that somebody's Shia, then you probably also know that they are more working class or lower class, that they're rural, all of these things. A real world example of this is Belgium, right? There's a lot, this is a synonymous in comparative politics for gridlock and not being able to get things done. That's because Belgium is very much divided, relatively 50-50 between these two different groups, Flanders and Wallonia, right? Where in Flanders they speak Flemish, and in Wallonia they speak French. In Flanders they are Protestant, in Wallonia they're Catholic, and so on and so forth. What we think is going on here is that when one identity is associated with all the other identities, it just raises the stakes of political conflict, right? So if you are, Sunni and a Shia leader is put into power, it's not just a threat to your religious identity, it is a threat to your geography and your class and your language and all these things. And I think that we see this today. This is what one of the dominant theories of American politics is often referred to as the problem of mega identity politics, that politics has really become our identity. So, right, we have these stereotypes about each other. And when you sort of say, okay, if I asked you to imagine a rural white voter with a high school education who goes to church twice a week, like, you have a very clear idea of that person's politics. The other way this can happen is by what's called cross-cutting cleavages. And this, instead of these identities always correlating relatively perfectly with one another, they cut across one another. So right here, this little simple visual is, well, just so that somebody's Arabic speaking doesn't mean you know their religion, and vice versa. A real world example of this is India. India has been, of course, has had a lot of its own governance struggles, but has defied a lot of theories of comparative politics because India is the largest democracy in the world, and it has this long run of being a successful democracy without the benefit of socioeconomic largesse, which seems to make democracy function a little more easily. It's been this really big surprise in comparative politics. I mean, frankly, people in the 50s and 60s did not think we'd be talking about Indian democracy in 2022 for a lot of socioeconomic reasons. But India is such a diverse country that just because you say, somebody is Hindu speaking doesn't really tell you much else about their identity. And this seems to add enough complexity in politics for us to build bridges across to meet somebody. In engaging in politics, I think one big piece of advice that I try to live by is to be surprising. Just because somebody is a white rural Christian voter doesn't mean you know everything about them. So I've got this visual here that even NRA members are largely supportive of things like a universal background check, right? We just don't think about that kind of thing. And again, we often misunderstand one another. We often have stereotypes. Oh, an NRA member, they're going to be completely against everything I believe in, but there actually is often some more middle ground there. And if we can set goals and work backwards from there about what they would really mean, we can often get places together. So be surprising yourself and make space for somebody on the other side to do so as well, right? So not presuming that you know exactly what somebody thinks, but asking and creating that space. So this is the book. I think maybe the best book in American politics. Liliana Mason writes this book called Uncivil Agreement. And I love this title because what she's basically saying is that the point that I just made, if you actually look at where Americans are on the substantive policy issues, there's real division. We're not going to erase that. But there's real common ground too. But if you look at how Americans feel about one another, it is a 100% holy war against one another, right? There's no middle ground. And so that's what Mason refers to as uncivil agreement. Her journal article version of this is called I Disrespectfully Agree, right? The idea that we actually end up agreeing on a lot of substance, but doing so uncivilly and so disrespectfully that we don't even need the actual policy conflict to hate each other and to deride each other. In political psychology, this is called affective polarization. So affect, which is how we feel about the world, not ideological polarization or position polarization, but just I don't like the other side. And again, this is the author of a lot of the mega identity politics stuff. She's really shown how over time, as racial and geographic and religious and all sorts of different identities have really coalesced around these sort of two parties, we have seen the perceived stakes of political conflict rise so much that we lose the sense of a legitimate opposition and we lose our ability to govern ourselves. So I guess that's a long way of saying it's really easy to to focus on differences, but also, make space for the possibilities that can exist, because we have a lot to do. Like, that's one thing we can unite Americans on. Like, we have some serious problems, and so let's talk about them and talk about where we want to go from here. A phrase that I often try to remember to use myself when I'm also getting very heated in a political conversation is, well, couldn't, if you're talking about abortion, couldn't we at least agree that we want to protect women's health? Right. I mean, there's and finding those moments can be very powerful. In psychology, the other way to bring it together is common goals. So, keep emphasizing, what if we could bicker about democracy versus republic a lot, but at the end of the day, what do we want? What does that look like? And working on that common goal. Because psychology can be a little bit depressing sometimes, and we have something called the negativity bias, by which we pay attention to and remember negative news better than positive news. Threats actually work really well to link us. So here's the moon landing. That's the common goal, of course, of putting somebody on the moon, but we know that was very much ginned up by the common threat of, hey, Americans, if we don't do this right, we're going to be surpassed by the Soviet Union. And there are a lot of common threats. Again, I think that if we can use some very simple psychology, trying not to reinforce those overlapping cleavages that I was talking about, right? Trying to be surprising that, just because my party identification or that I live in Durango doesn't mean you know X, Y, or Z about me, is one way. And another way is thinking, couldn't we at least, and then thinking about these common goals and common threats that we face, because there's a lot of them. So preaching to the choir here, right? I know, but one of the big problems that we've seen, and this is a really great book, Timothy Snyder, who is a scholar, sort of in between history and political science. He focuses on 20th century Europe, so he has a lot to say about the rise and fall of different regimes, of democracies and of fascism, totalitarian systems. And one of his he has 20 lessons. It's a really easy, fun, I wouldn't say fun if you're a political scientist or if you're interested in this stuff, but it's a very light read. He goes through 20 different things that we've learned about how to protect self-governance. And to me, the biggest thing is this idea of when we are unwilling to separate ourselves and from what we want to be the truth from the actual truth, we really submit to tyranny. So, right, you submit to tyranny when you announce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case. And I think it's really easy for us to see that happening on one side of the political spectrum. And I think we can both say that it can happen on one side of the political spectrum more severely, but still be a problem across all of us, because again, we all have these confirmation biases. So here, here's the eat your vegetables portion of the talk, which is really engage with people. So we to have a democracy need real political opponents, like legitimate political opponents. And I think the tricky thing for the Democrats right now is that I can understand, like, you want to win the elections, but you also, the Republican Party sort of leaving the Democratic game is a problem for the Democratic Party too, because that leaves this real lack of an ability to offer the American public a genuine trade-off. In looking at history such as the rise of the National Socialist Party, the Nazis in Germany, what happens again and again in cases like that is who it comes down to is often the sort of the centrist forces on that side, right? So a lot of historians now will point to the center right of Germany that saw an opportunity to get their own political checklists done, riding that emotion that Hitler was bringing, and they open the door and then legitimize it, right? So I think we see similar things. Now, what I'm saying here is that thinking about the other side as a monolith is not going to be very helpful, because there are going to be those who are unreachable, right? You're probably not going to get anywhere with them. But there are a lot of people who have conflicted views, and when you approach them all guns blaring, really the only way that they can save face is to fight back and to join the extremes of their side. But if we can make a space to invite people to take nuanced views, I think we would be surprised how often that happens. So another good book, Arthur Brooks, who's a member of this center right class, really talking about the importance of learning from another. Another basic perspective on this is that the problems we face are really complicated, and so we really just need, critical debate and disagreement is actually a huge opportunity for us to come up with important solutions to these problems that we face together. I see a lot of familiar faces, so you've heard me go on about this before, but this is just what I study, so I want to make the plug for distinguishing between our negative emotions. Like, I'm not telling you to, like, you know, to have a kumbaya moment and sacrifice your own beliefs, but rather that there's a better ways to engage in conflict, and in particular, engaging in conflict when we're angry can be useful. Anger is actually widely misunderstood, but a certain degree of anger can be healthy, because anger, if I'm angry with you, it means that I want to change your behavior so that I can salvage our ability to be together, to work together. Contempt or disgust is what we really need to worry about, because that's an inherently dehumanizing emotion. And so you hear that this little cute kid rolling his eyes, and that's like the real sign of contempt. And this has been very much studied and applied with political polarization. But interestingly, this comes from the study of romantic relationships. Particularly, you may have heard of John Gottman, who's a really famous marriage counselor, and was very famous because he could watch on mute a couple talk about, they would just ask a couple, talk about something that you disagree about in your relationship, and he could watch them muted for 5 minutes and predict with over 95% certainty whether they'd be together or divorced in a couple of years. And all he looked for was signs of eye rolling. If one partner rolled their eyes while the other partner was talking, he called that the marital kiss of death. Because what contempt is saying is that you're not worth my time. I'm better than you. You are not fully human, and I just don't even want to deal with you anymore. Unfortunately, that's where we are as a political culture right now. And so instead of the anger where we could be like, anger can make us, okay, like, engage, have it out, stay long at that meeting so that we can figure out, you know, what tactic or policy. Contempt just means we're not dealing with the other people. Now, we didn't fall into this culture of contempt by accident. I would argue, and a lot of other scholars would argue, that this is by design. It is very profitable to piss us off at each other. We know one of the best predictors. So for example, a Facebook algorithm, people are most likely to share things that enrage them, outrage, anger, disgust even. Those sorts of stories get shared. The recent whistleblower released documents showing that you know, Facebook is trying to predict what you want to see. Something that you know, some acquaintance of yours says that it just is predicted to make you really, really angry, that's going to be 5 times favored by their algorithm than an update from one of your closest friends or family members, right? And so that, like, this, and why? Because that gets us to stay on Facebook longer, and we just keep getting angrier and angrier and scrolling more and more and selling more and more advertising revenue for you know, Mark and Cheryl. But what it does is benefit them while really harming us. I mean, and not just our polity and our ability to govern each other, but the experience of contempt towards other people is physiologically quite detrimental to our health. It's a state of sympathetic activation that really kills people. So, you know, do it for your cardiovascular health, if not for the health of your democracy. So I think there's a lot of possibilities for new ways to engage. This book goes through all of these really cool experiments that have been done with deliberative democracy, bringing regular folks to City Hall and having them design the budget are priorities. Mongolia has even had constitutional referendum where a random sample of people are brought in. So engaging and deliberating with ourselves and different groups could be a really powerful role here. We need to go beyond just like allowing the other side to exist and having them allow us to exist. Like we actually need some sense that they're humans. We don't have to like them or agree with them, but like a sense that there's equal humans as we are. I think that the real engagement is very possible, very rewarding. Like I said, every semester I teach political psychology, and every semester my students have to have what they call the contentious conversation, where we go through the psychology of polarization and ways that you can engage. And they say, okay, my dad and I yell at each other about immigration all the time. I'm going to try and have a conversation with my dad about immigration. And they plan it out. They write a paper on the psychology of what they're going to do. And they're always not happy about this assignment, I will say, to put it lightly. They do not want to do this. But then after they do it, they're so empowered because they can't imagine, like, I talked to my dad about immigration and we didn't actually change each other's minds, but like, we talked about it, we connected. Like, I get why he says that. I really disagree with him, but I was able to engage in it. So I think the anxiety and fear about this is real. I want to acknowledge that, but the possibility is also there. So again, who to talk to. I'm not telling you like, to go to the most extreme person on your Facebook feed, right? That's not likely going to get you anywhere. But again, remembering that some of the key players, in 2024, when we're talking about who rightfully won this election, what we really need is that the centrists on both sides come together and look at the data. I mean, that's ultimately what we really need. And so, creating those personal connections with who I would call, sort of the reachable right, I think is a really powerful prophylactic measure to take here. Most of us have some sort of relationship in our family that, has been harmed by politics. So I'll, my half brother and I, like, he's who I would call the unreachable right. Like, we just cannot, like, we just live in very different places. But like my in-laws are Trump supporters, but like they're people I can talk to, and like and that is the space where we need to really be operating right now, is the reachable right. There's also some really cool effort. I mean, I am by no means the only person saying this. People who study democratic governance are flipping out right now because it's happening, it's hitting the fan. And we know that creating linkages between the warring camps is really the only thing that's going to break the escalatory cycle that we're facing. And so Braver Angels is an organization they have fascinating conversations, bringing somebody on one side and then the other side to talk about truly the most controversial issues of our time. And they really disagree, but it's really fascinating how often they can hear each other and learn from each other. So again, here's 2 more books about same title, We Need to Talk. So again, like I said, I am not the only person preaching this. This is a really good book by a journalist for NPR who's really talking about it. And these are a few comparative politics analysts. And in both cases, they're saying, we really need to talk about things that matter. And again, not trying to persuade, but rather trying to just like create a space where we can be human together, disagree, learn from each other. So, don't worry about convincing. In fact, I think the best advice I can give you is that if you're trying to convince, that's going to be really obvious through your body language, through the way that you present yourself, and that is going to subconsciously raise the shields, raise the defenses. It can be really disarming just to, instead of responding with a point, to just say like, oh, where did you hear that? Instead of trying to convince, trying to learn something new. And that really perceptibly changes the whole nature of that conversation. So just asking open-ended questions and sticking with it. And just rather than saying, I have to win this, like I have to take my Republican cousin and change the way she feels about abortion, like that's not going to happen. But you actually might be able to educate each other a little bit and kind of depolarize each other. And in that process, just by creating that connection, create a stronger, center wing of both sides, which again is what it's going to take to get us out of this. So Karen's talking about the Plata civil dialogue, and Sally's on here too. We're trying to do something like that, and we'd love to work with anybody who's interested. So President Sturdicus at Fort Lewis College commissioned me to start this new program called Community by Conversation. And we had our first event, actually a few of you were there, so thank you for your support. We had our first event last November about housing. And I think this year, and so this is my political psychology students and FLC Engage students work on this, and we don't have one on the calendar right now because as we were doing that, Omicron broke out and we just decided it was too complicated to try and put a date on something. We had no idea what was going to happen, but we're probably going to be able to resume, we hope, in March or April. So I'll definitely reach out to you all and to the Republic. We'll be reaching out to everybody. But I think that this year we would like to talk about election security and election legitimacy and have conversations across the political spectrum about what that looks like. So keep an eye out for that. So I'm almost done here, so we can have Q&A. As I've mentioned, right, these things are cyclical. There's already there's very much already a lot of grievances on both sides, and it's really only going to be by not validating wrongdoing. Certainly, this is not what I'm saying, but rather creating that space for reasonable people on both sides to admit that we all have problems, and that if all we're going to be doing is pointing out the other side's problems, we are in fact part of that problem. Like that just perpetuates this cycle. So again, not the happiest news to tell, but I think true. So really working to, and this is the hard thing. I see some discussion in the chat that I'm sure we'll discuss much more in the Q&A, but the hard thing is establishing some sort of shared sources of information. I do this in all of my classes and it works really well, where it's just like, okay, we're not going to always agree, but like, usually my tried and true is like the Associated Press, because they don't really do any editorializing. They just, here's what happened, here's what they said. But trying to find some common sources can be really great. When you hear, when people are going off on a diatribe with you, just again, rather than shooting them down and saying like, no, you're an idiot, you have no idea what you're talking about. If you read Breitbart, you have a single digit IQ. That again, they're locked and loaded to keep arguing with you. If you just ask, oh, that's interesting, where did you hear that? Or from my perspective, I don't understand how that works. Like, can you explain it to me? That has this really powerful effect of changing the conversation in surprising ways. And again, getting on some shared, we need some shared understandings of what we're talking about and what we're going after. So what does democracy mean to people? What does good government mean to you? What does fair government mean to you? We might find a lot more shared ground, and if we can't find the truth, and again, this isn't about you finding the truth, this is about like, if we as a polity that disagrees with one another can't find some semblance of the truth, we can't have a strong enough center to hold, then it'll break. And I get asked a lot, like, what'll happen? Like, I don't know. we don't know. But we should try and avoid it, would be my advice. I just want to make a plug. I'm doing a lifelong learning talk on this book, Gellin Porter's The Politics Industry. This is going to be a lot more about how our political divisions are actually quite profitable for certain people. So these are two really, really great resources, right? And so there's a lot that we can have conversations about. Again, there are so many democracy deepening pathways forward. There's so many problems. There's so many ways to think about moving beyond those problems. And there's actually a lot of bipartisan support for a lot of these things, like just changing the relationship with money and politics in particular, but also a lot of issues around like some basic good governance stuff that we have not really touched as a country, but a lot of countries are far ahead of us in terms of more proportionality in our voting and our primary systems. So there's lots of work there. Will be a lot of conversations to have. This is a really exciting way to get active. And I would say that we have, again, this existential threat, which is also a big opportunity to deepen our politics. Yeah, and so rather than going after the person, right, think about political structures. Rather than thinking about the individual that you're angry at in the moment, think about, okay, what political structures are there and how can we work together to change them? Very much in line with a sort of creating cross-cutting dialogues across different lines of identity or cleavages. This is the idea of being active in civil society organizations. So congratulations, you all are part of a civil society organizations with the La Plata County Dems. Civil society is simply just that, it's associations between people, book clubs, churches, volunteer organizations. These are all civil society organizations. A very famous social scientist, Putnam, argues, I think quite convincingly, and this is a whole huge literature, that really civil society is the magic sauce that makes government work really well. And they distinguish between what's called bonding civil society, which is being in a group with people who are basically like you, and bridging social capital in civil society, which is being in groups where there are people that might not think like you. So Putnam very famously was worried. He actually very much was like, American democracy is going to people are going to be living in different realities and they're going to fight, was what he predicts in the 1990s. And he thought that was because we're not going to things like bowling leagues together, right? Where now, instead of the other side being like, well, somebody that you bowl with every Tuesday night, it's this sort of faceless ghost demon thing on Fox News. And so thinking about organizations you can be a part of, I think this one is great. Of course, this would be very much in terms of politics, bonding social capital, although when I appreciate talking about, across all sorts of different ideologies that many Democrats bring to the table. But, your church organizations, your volunteer organizations, these are really good places to build connections, because it's the sense of connection between people that we know creates less fertile breeding grounds for this populist rage on the one hand, and also through extremism. We're finding more and more that political extremism and radicalization comes from a sense of isolation, loneliness, and grievance. And so these organizations become really important places where people can find connection. And so here are, like, of course, I'm going to plug for FLC Engage, working with students to do so. There are so many good organizations. A really good one is this Common Cause organization. They're working on a lot of really fascinating democratic reforms. And so there's the Colorado constituent or affiliate rather. There's also a national affiliate working on federal level stuff. All right. Sorry, I'm a professor. There's too much content. Leadership matters, though. I don't have to tell you that. You all care about this. But what I would say, and there's a lot of really fascinating work on this going on in political psychology. Look out for being duped by your own side. I mean, and of course, you're all thinking, like, what about the other side? Like, yes, them too. We don't find people being fooled very often by their political opponents, and that's because you expect it. You're looking for it. You're on watch for that. But we're often fooled by the people we agree with, or that we want to agree with, or that we perceive a likeness with. And so really being careful of our own sides, I think, can sometimes be a useful thing. And again, being a unique, surprising individual, not just parroting the political talking points, but rather being your own independent, critical thinker. And then showing that to somebody can be a really powerful way forward. And then finally, when it does hit the fan, knowing that political action and taking to the streets does seem to work. So this is a recent book. Erica Chenoweth has been doing research for a long time, and she really has this argument that if even the most oppressive regimes, once about 3% of the population is in the streets, it's really hard for them to push back against the people, because it just becomes too big of a mass for even the police state to do much about. And usually what happens when the police state does strike out is that there's a huge backlash, and that and so really, we can see enormous change, but the key is that this has to be, these movements are successful when they're nonviolent and when they bring a lot of people together, right? So if the national narrative becomes that these are a fringe group who is lashing out violently, then the court of public opinion is not going to be swayed by that. But if it's a big, diverse coalition with lots of different people together acting peacefully to stand up for something like an election result, then there's actually quite encouraging science, again, looking at other cases. I think that, right here in Colorado, we actually had some really huge change. I mean, things that on the national scene, like if you tell somebody who really works in the sphere of criminal justice reform that we got qualified immunity erased in Colorado in 2020 based upon that large movement for racial justice, like that's mind blowing to a lot of people in other states. And so the change really can happen. All right, so call to action, right? It's up to us. Like it's a scary time, but that this is also a time of great agency. What we do now, the decisions we make, the conversations we have or don't have a lot of consequences. And so it's really time to lean into politics being the art of the possible and imagining what is possible, because it's also the politics is also the art of the unthinkable. And so I'll leave it there. And I know a lot of things were coming in on the chat. Sorry, I wasn't able to read them. So I'm going to actually stop sharing for now and take questions. How do we want to do this?
Well, so hopefully Kathy and Karen have been sort of monitoring what's going on in the chat. I mean, there's a lot in the chat this time, so it may be difficult to get all of the questions answered, but let's start there. The other thing that I'll say is we're going to send out a link to this recording at a later time. So if there are people that might have wanted to participate here but weren't able to, the recording will probably be available tomorrow if I get it done, which typically I can. And then Paul just put in the chat a link to the slides that he was using. So we would invite everybody to share both the recording and the slides because the whole purpose here is to get these ideas out. And that's why we invited Paul to attend. So Kathy or Karen, who wants to go first with?
I'll go first.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I thought this was very interesting. In trying to control misinformation, is that antithetical to free speech?
That's a really great question. I mean, what I would say, this is an old debate, right? And so, and it's an old and enduring debate because there are some really important values here, right? You can be really wrong, but we shouldn't take away your right to speak your mind. I mean, I think that, you know, this is the old view on free speech and sort of the tradition of sort of classic John Stuart Mill's liberalism, is that the way to handle false speech typically is, or what we might consider harmful speech, is not through infringing on somebody's rights, that is to say, making it illegal, but rather with better, louder, more correct speech, right? So not by banning somebody from speaking, but from lots of other people speaking out against that and taking it on. So, you know, I go through this a lot because, I mean, college campuses are now seen as like this, you know, breeding ground of cancel culture. And, you know, really, I find a lot of, you know, what both sides want is to feel respected. And I think that people feel disrespected in a lot of ways. And so what I always tell students is like, you know, you're able to speak. I'm not, you know, I believe, I volunteer with the ACLU. I believe in your right to say things, even when I really think that they're wrong. But, right, your speech can have consequences. That's not taking away your rights. Like when speech having consequences by people talking back or clapping back, as they say, right, that is part of free speech too. So yeah, there's a real tension there. And of course, there's a lot of, and I will be the first to say, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I know there's a lot of constitutional law about when speech actually comprises an immediate threat, right? So that's the you know, the famous, you know, yelling fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire. That speech can cause immediate physical harm to somebody. But the, you know, misinformation, I think the way to do that is not by some sort of banning of it, but rather by engagement, right? Where does that come from? How did you find that out? Here's what I found, and here are my more reputable sources, right? When we just outright ban things that we don't like, of course, that just creates more of a backlash. That can actually that just makes people more sure that they're right. My humble opinion.
Karen, can you come up with the next question?
I'll go up to Jeff Dolman. Asked, he said, too many voters convinced that their false alternate truths are real, unable to understand that they're unable to discern which candidates or parties act in their best interest and which ones don't. So they're voting consistently against their best interest. How can such folks be taught to find the real truth? That's why we're here.
Yeah, this is and that's again another enduring question, because it's always applicable, and it's a big one. This is a big argument. So in that Against Democracy book, like this is a big argument he sinks his teeth into and says like this is why why rule by the people is always going to be really tricky. I come at it from a different place. I think that, you know, somebody's always going to have to decide about policies, and I think that public, you know, popular sovereignty, the public signing off on that is going to be the best way towards political legitimacy and peace. But this does open up and maintain this really big problem that most people don't know much about politics and like what actually causes what in the social world. And so again, I don't think that there's an easy answer for this. What I would say is that there's a noticeable, I would say palpable discourse of, oh, you don't understand your own interests. And saying it that way really, again, just causes a backlash. And we've all been in arguments where, you know, that you might feel a shift in yourself. I am not going to concede this point no matter what, right? And that's, I think, that kind of, if I come at you and say like, oh, you're just misunderstood or misled, misinformed, and you don't even know your own interests, like that's condescension that will like yield that. And so again, I think that open-ended questions become really important. Like, I'm surprised that you would support this when my view is this, or that I've heard this. Like, just again, asking questions. You're not going to change somebody else's mind, but you might actually be more effective in depolarizing, or sort of allowing there to be some uncertainty, acknowledging like, okay, like you say that taxes always lead to this. What do you mean by that? What about this exception? What about this example? people will convince themselves often. You're not going to convince somebody else. So yeah, I would avoid the framing of like, you're doing it wrong, like you don't understand your own needs, and rather go for a framing of, oh, I'm surprised, what's going on there? And again, leading with the, I'm interested in you as another person. I care, like you are, I assume that you are as equally smart and capable and as aware as me. And proceeding from there with open-ended questions, and then of course, as you can, like other examples and data points, rather than that sort of speaking down to, because I think that like that's a big source of our political grievances is feeling spoken down to and stereotyped.
Okay, Kathy.
Someone raised a question. In your opinion, is this kind of conversation that we're having today happening on the other side, the more conservative persuasion?
Yeah, this is, and I saw another comment at some point where somebody was asking, like, have we reached out with community-based conversation to Republicans, and what have they said? We have had a hard time at Fort Lewis getting, not all, but we, sort of the La Plata Republicans to engage too much. And I think there's this discourse about college campuses, which I think is a real shame, because frankly, I have a lot of conservative students who would really like to see more representation of their own views. And I would say my sense is that it is happening on both sides, but this could go really deep. There's a lot of psychological differences between people on the left and right. And some of those psychological differences do have to do with, we think, again, these are active debates and studies of political psychology, but some of those have to do with the rigidity. It's literally, the hypothesis is called the rigidity of the right hypothesis. And there seems to be less willingness to have some of these compromising conversations. What I would say to that is that I don't know that that's true. Again, that rigidity of the right hypothesis is quite contentious, but also that it's not, again, we can't think of the right as a monolith. I think that there are people who are engaging, and I know from doing some of this outreach, and that's really important. Again, thinking about people in the center who are not quite as on both sides, right? Who are movable in certain ways, it becomes really important. This has been there's a lot of debates about this, though. So in American politics, there has been some evidence that this polarization has been asymmetric. So not that it doesn't exist on the left, but that on the left, it's often been reactionary. I've seen some people mentioning like Fox News. Like Fox News is very much seen as the entrepreneur for outrageous politics in the United States, but of course, then that starts a sort of a race to the bottom. So I would say that there is, though. Like, so if you look again at an organization like Common Cause or Braver Angels, we are finding a lot of people on the political right who are engaging in these conversations. And again, it's not about reaching everybody. It's not about taking Lauren Boebert's strongest supporters and changing their minds, right? That's not going to happen. But it is really about people identifying those who are sort of reachable in some ways and having those conversations.
Okay, Karen, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, kid just came home. Carol asks, how does the potential ability to modify our democracy based on changing circumstances fare in the face of strict constitutional interpretation in some sectors of the right? And it makes me think of the Second Amendment, but yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that there is a sort of sense of like the Constitution says it, so the Constitution can't be touched. That can be really hard. I mean, I think some of the most impactful reforms that we could have would, change some of our electoral laws, which would require some constitutional changes. And so I think that is a real barrier. It's always a political barrier, that the way that things have been done, political traditions are always going to be given a lot of weight. And so again, I think that it's about identifying some common goals first, not starting the conversation with, I want to change the Second Amendment or I want to change this or the other, but rather starting the conversation with, how do we get how do we get money out of politics, or how do we introduce this, that, or the other? Like, how do we pursue this goal or rise to this shared challenge or shared threat? And then working backwards from that and evaluating the extent to which we need to change things like even the Constitution. But there, there is going to be a lot of pushback there. But again, it's about creating a space where people on both sides can make up their own minds and be surprising. Once we go all out attack formation, then then somebody who may have been inclined to be open-minded to that can really quickly close their mind, because it becomes about the political battle and about winning, not about actually solving a shared problem. And so it's really that mind shift that's really, it's hard. Nothing that I'm saying is easy, but I think that's really the space we need to work to cultivate.
Okay, Kathy.
I'm going to throw my own thing in here too, along with what someone else said. But basically, it's about our legal system and the Supreme Court and the politicization of the Supreme Court that's going on right now. How can we expect to have fair interpretation of the constitutional discussion about democracy? I mean, how can that be fairly applied to hopefully correct some of the problems we've got, given the situation of the political nature that seems to be overlaying the Supreme Court right now?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for this, because I don't really know what is to be done by that. What I would say is that the Supreme Court typically follows rather than leads. I mean, even with like a big decision like Obergefell in 2015, that seems sudden from certain places, like, oh, they just like went out and legalized same-sex marriage. But of course, that was the culmination of decades of advocacy with queer activists and allied communities, and a very robust long-term legal strategy and changing American public opinion over decades, right? And so the things I'm talking about are likely we're gonna have to think about them in longer terms. And the Supreme Court, very divided, but still the leadership of that court is very much dedicated to at least the illusion of the Supreme Court being, above politics. And so I think there's a sense to which it's really going to be about, again, changing public opinion, raising awareness, and not expecting the court to lead, but rather creating pressure across different identities and demographics for something that will then become hard for the Supreme Court to uphold. I mean, I saw Carol, you raised dark money, and I think one of the issues with money in politics, of course, going back to Citizens United, is the interpretation of the donation of money as part of your First Amendment right to freedom of speech, for example. And so that is like that deeply literal interpretation of the First Amendment to include money turns that into a constitutional question. And so again, I think it's about awareness raising and really changing the nature of how we have that conversation. That would need to happen first. A robust conversation about, okay, like, we really do want to protect the freedom of speech. That's really important. But where do we think about that being political expression? Like, where do we draw that line of political expression and balance some of the other rights that we hold dear, right? So you could talk about countering that with some equality rights. So that's what I would say. But again, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm not a Supreme Court scholar. Those are very complicated topics of their own. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer for that.
Okay. The next conversation, I think, is about shared space. Anne mentioned discuss reclaiming shared public space. And then Carol said, isn't the lack of shared public space due in part to the loss of newspaper readership and the decline of public schools as a standard educational institution? And then there's a couple other comments about shared space as well.
Yeah, and the shared space is so hard right now. And there's a lot, I think that the trends that you all are recognizing are really a big part of the problem. A lot of this goes down to this idea of the role of technology. And it's going to get worse. I mean, so Facebook's rebranding as Meta. The idea there is that you live in your own virtual reality. I mean, like, it's just this whole like where you can experience whatever you want or don't want, right? Keep everything else out. And so I think that this is going to be really hard to solve in terms of like, there's no one answer to that. There's not I can't like wave my wand and say like this policy will fix that problem. This has to be a general awareness of like, what our values are as individuals and as a society, that we need to kind of create this sense of being present. Again, I would argue that one of the best ways to do this in our own lives is to just be active. I mean, sort of, choose a cause, or, like a volunteer organization or something, and just like go there to further that cause, volunteer, whatever it is, but also meet people. Creating that sort of civil society is, I think, where shared space can come from. But no, I'm quite gloomy on where we are, and a lot of that has to do with the information technology through which all our politics are mediated these days, and they're very siloed. And so the decline, we're very lucky to have a robust local paper. Most communities of our size do not, right? So, but the decline of those shared sources of information is a really big part of it. And so I don't think that we're going to be able to say that, we're going to come up with a site that makes everybody happy and we can all just agree, like, to get our news from here. But rather, I would say it's about upholding a social norm. What does it mean to be a good American and a good citizen? Well, that means engaging with thoughts that are outside of my own sort of information bubble. I think that there's sort of some cultural norms that we need to really work on developing there.
One more thing, Ann Marquardt is asking what you think maybe some common goals are that we could try to pursue.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a lot, and again, I would go to a site like Common Cause, which has some of this polling data, but there are, on basically anything that you can find some sort of common goal. So policy arguments such as immigration and abortion appear to be so polarized. Like there's no common ground whatsoever, and there are real polls and there are real differences. But for example, there's a lot of common ground on wanting to reform immigration, right? An understanding that the way that we have is unfair. There's the discourse of like people should do it just legally or have open border, like that's in a lot of ways a false choice. And so with anything that you care about, I think what might be helpful is actually looking at some of the polling data, and Pew, Gallup, Common Cause, and More in Common. And my slides have some links to some of these organizations if you wanted to like kind of do your own research. Whatever you care about, I'll bet you can find something where there's some common ground. So like my students right now, their number, they very much react to the times, right? And so a lot of my students are doing research projects and conversations around reproductive rights and abortion. And that is, I think, one of the hardest issues, right? For a lot of reasons we could go into. But even then, they can say, like both sides want to protect health, protect autonomy, and ultimately decrease the number of abortions. So you can get into a space where you're having that conversation. There are a lot of shared things. So a lot of procedural things that can kind of be boring, but would make a huge difference, like changing the primary system, changing some of our electoral systems, ideas such as ranked choice voting, the role of money in politics. There are some of those procedural issues that political elites that are both Republicans and Democrats don't like because those institutions put them in power, but that actually among most people are enormously popular. And so you can create, actually, I think, quite a lot of connection by talking about issues such as, redoing the primary process, because that really only benefits a very small portion of sort of the political industrial complex on either side. So I would say those big procedural issues have a lot of common ground, actually. But even within some of the most polarized issues, with just 20 minutes of research, I'll bet you can find some ways to frame this as we're pursuing a shared goal or responding to a shared threat. And you could be surprised there that once you get beyond sort of the talking points, you can often find some ground for connection, if not complete not complete understanding, not complete endorsement of the other side, but rather some places where you can work together.
Okay, it's 1:30 now, so I think we're going to need to stop. This is typically our stopping time. I will send out a transcript of the chat windows. So if people want to communicate amongst yourselves, or I suspect you can email Paul if you've got some specific things that you want to talk about or questions. So there's lots of opportunity here. We probably could go on for another 2 or 3 hours if we were so inclined. So let's give a virtual round of applause to our speaker and thank him for participating. This has just been great, I think.
Well, thank you all so much for having this conversation. I think this is really important. And yeah, I just put my info, my email, that's the best way to get in touch with me, in the chat. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And like I said, we're trying to do some of this work on campus with Community by Conversation and FLC Engage. So as somebody was just saying, oh yeah, Karen, yeah, find just getting involved, just being active and meeting with other people who are active, I think is a really powerful way to do that. So I applaud you all for doing that already.
Well, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, our next Club Luncheon will take place on March 1st, and it'll feature the Democratic candidates. I think we'll have either 5 or 6 of them in a forum where we'll give them time for an opening statement and then have them entertain questions from the audience. Did we have anybody else that put anything in the chat about another announcement that they needed to make? I didn't see anything. So I'm going to assume that there's not.
Hey,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Ann. I'd like to mention one quick thing I don't think got mentioned, which is there's going to be a Care and Share Healthy Snacks food drive. The Democrats are sponsoring it. It's going to be held at locations in Durango, Bayfield, and Ignacio. It's to benefit the Ignacio youth programs, after school youth programs. And we're looking for individually packaged healthy snacks, jerky, popcorn, trail mix, good quality protein bars, whatever it might be. So that will be on Valentine's weekend. It will be on February 12th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And the locations were sent out in the newsletter, but they're in 3 different places. And we would love people to donate some food for the kids in Ignacio. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. Those of you in the Bayfield area will be at the Pine River Public Library. There are a couple of us taking those donations. Karen, did you have something else?
Oh, it's on the Dems website if you want more information, laplatadems.org.
Okay.
And I would like to ask Paul before you leave, you said you're going to do a lifelong learning. Which one? I could look it up, but
I believe it's March 31st, March 30th, the last couple of days. And that's, we're going to be talking about the politics industry, which is that Gellin Porter. They have some really fascinating ideas for some of these things that I was talking about. Some of the, what can be kind of, at first glance, kind of boring procedural changes to how we count votes and how we conduct elections and primaries and things like that. But that we know from looking at other countries could really change the dynamics of political competition.
Okay, and those of you that are interested in these kinds of things, Great Decisions is back this year, and I will be doing a presentation next Tuesday at noon or 11:45 on climate change. So if you like to get involved in those kinds of things, check out the Great Decisions that's going on in Durango, and we're hoping that we can actually get back to doing them in person here in another month or so. Okay, appreciate everybody attending, and we'll hope to see you next month. Everybody have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.